The sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of Dust Horn Mountain when Caleb McGraw stepped onto the weathered porch of his cabin, coffee steaming in his calloused hands. The morning air carried the familiar scent of sagebrush and the distant lowing of cattle, a sound that had become as natural to him as his own heartbeat. At 28, Caleb had carved out a modest life from this unforgiving stretch of Colorado territory, where the wind never seemed to stop and the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles south. He was a man built for this land, broad shoulders that could wrestle a steer to the ground, hands that knew the weight of a rope and the feel of leather reins, and eyes the color of storm clouds that had seen enough hardship to make him cautious but not bitter. His dark hair, perpetually tousled by the constant breeze, framed a face that spoke of honesty and determination. Caleb McGraw was the kind of man who kept his word, paid his debts, and asked little of the world except to be left alone to tend his cattle and his dreams. Those dreams had grown considerably larger 6 months ago when he rode into the dusty town of Redemption Creek and met Sarah Elizabeth Porter. She had been standing outside Whitman's general store, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light like spun copper, arguing with the shopkeeper about the price of flour. There was something in her voice, not just the sweet musical quality of it, but the steel underneath, that made Caleb rein in his horse and listen. Sarah Porter was no wilting flower. She stood barely 5 feet tall, but there was a fire in her green eyes that suggested she could hold her own against whatever the frontier threw at her. $3 for a sack of flour is highway robbery, Mr. Whitman, she was saying, her hands planted firmly on her hips. I can get the same for $2.50 in Denver, and that's with the shipping costs. Whitman, a portly man with thinning hair and a perpetual scowl, crossed his arms. Denver's 100 miles from here. Miss Porter, you want Denver prices. You can take yourself to Denver. That's when Caleb dismounted and tipped his hat. Afternoon. Miss, I couldn't help but overhear. He reached into his vest pocket and placed $3 silver on the counter. I'll take 2 sacks of that flour, Mr. Whitman, and the lady will take hers for $2.50. Sarah turned those green eyes on him, and Caleb felt something shift inside his chest. I don't need charity from strangers. Mr. McGraw, Caleb McGraw, and it's not charity. Miss, it's good business. I really do need the flour, and I reckon fair is fair. She studied his face for a long moment, then smiled, the first genuine smile Caleb had seen in Redemption Creek in years. Sarah Porter, and I thank you kindly, Mr. McGraw. That was how it started. Caleb found reasons to visit town more frequently after that. He learned that Sarah had come west from Ohio after her parents died of typhus, carrying nothing but a small trunk and dreams of making a new life. She worked as a seamstress for the local ladies and helped the doctor's wife with difficult births. She had gentle hands, but a backbone of iron. And when she laughed, it was like hearing music after years of silence. The courtship was brief by Eastern standards, but typical for the frontier, where life moved quickly and second chances were rare. 3 months after they met, Caleb asked Sarah's hand in marriage outside the little white church in Redemption Creek. She said yes with tears in her eyes and kissed him right there in front of God and half the town. Their wedding was simple. Sarah wore a dress of blue calico that she'd sewn herself, and Caleb had borrowed a proper suit from Doc Morrison. The preacher spoke of love enduring through hardship, of 2 becoming one flesh, and of the sacred bond between husband and wife. When Caleb slipped the thin gold band onto Sarah's finger, his hands trembled slightly. When she whispered, "I do," her voice was steady and sure. The first months of their marriage unfolded like a dream Caleb had never dared to have. Sarah transformed the rough cabin into a home with curtains at the windows, wildflowers in mason jars, and the smell of fresh bread that greeted him when he returned from the range. She learned to milk the cow and tend the vegetable garden, her city hands growing strong and capable. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold while Sarah read aloud from the few books they owned. She was fascinated by the cattle, pestering Caleb with questions about breeding and grazing until he began taking her with him on short rides around the property. Sarah proved to be a natural horsewoman, sitting her mare with confidence and helping him move the small herd to better pasture. She had opinions about everything: which bull was the strongest, where they should dig the new well, how to expand the cabin when the time came. By autumn, Sarah was expecting their first child. The news filled Caleb with a joy so intense it frightened him. He had grown up an orphan, never knowing the love of a real family, and now he would have both wife and child. He began working on an addition to the cabin immediately, framing out a room that would serve as a nursery. Sarah would stand in the doorway in the evenings, her hand resting on her still small belly, watching him work. "It's going to be beautiful," she would say. And Caleb would pause in his hammering to look at her, backlit by the golden light from inside the cabin, and think that he had never seen anything more beautiful in his life. Winter came early that year, with bitter winds and snow that piled against the cabin walls. But inside, they were warm and content. Sarah's belly grew round, and she would take Caleb's hand and place it where the baby kicked, her eyes bright with wonder. They spent long evenings by the fire, making plans and dreaming of the future. Caleb would build up the herd, maybe buy the Anderson place when old Henrik decided to sell. Sarah talked about teaching their children to read and write, maybe even sending them to school in Denver someday. Spring arrived with a rush of melting snow and green grass, and Sarah bloomed along with the wildflowers that carpeted the meadows around their home. She was 6 months along now, moving with the careful grace of a woman carrying precious cargo, but still insisting on helping with the lighter chores. Caleb worried about her constantly, but Sarah would laugh and tell him she wasn't made of china. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Caleb McGraw," she would say, "I'm stronger than I look." She was right about that. Sarah Porter McGraw was the strongest person Caleb had ever known, and he told her so every chance he got. It was a Tuesday in early May when Caleb's world ended. He had ridden out before dawn to check on the cattle in the north pasture, where wolves had been spotted the week before. The work took longer than expected. He found evidence of a kill and spent the morning tracking the pack to make sure they had moved on. By the time he started home, the sun was already sinking toward the western peaks. He could see the cabin from a mile away, a small dark shape against the golden grass. And something was wrong. No smoke rose from the chimney. No light showed in the windows. The place looked empty, abandoned. Caleb spurred his horse into a gallop, his heart hammering against his ribs. He called Sarah's name as he rode, but only the wind answered. The front door stood slightly ajar, moving gently in the breeze, and when Caleb pushed it open, the silence inside the cabin was complete and terrible. "Sarah!" He searched every room, overturning furniture, looking in places too small to hide a person. Her sewing basket sat overturned by her chair, thread and fabric scattered across the floor. A cup of coffee sat cold on the kitchen table. Barely touched, the bed was unmade, as if she had risen in a hurry. Outside, Caleb found the first real clue: Sarah's blue handkerchief, the one he had given her for Christmas, lying crumpled near the woodpile. It was stained with blood. The trail was easy enough to follow at first. Drag marks in the soft earth led away from the cabin toward the tree line, but the rocky ground near the forest swallowed all traces. Caleb searched until full dark, calling Sarah's name until his voice gave out, but found nothing more. Word spread quickly in a territory where neighbors were few and help was precious. By morning, half the men from Redemption Creek had arrived to join the search. They combed the forests and canyons for 3 days, following every game trail and checking every cave and gulch. On the 3rd day, they found a piece of Sarah's dress hanging from a thorn bush near Devil's Drop, a sheer cliff that fell 200 feet to the rocks below. The men stood at the edge of the precipice, looking down at the churning water of Willow Creek far below, and nobody wanted to say what they were all thinking. Doc Morrison put a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "I'm sorry, son," he said quietly. "I'm real sorry." They held the funeral on a Thursday afternoon. just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. There was no body to bury, so Caleb placed Sarah's wedding ring in a small wooden box and lowered it into the ground himself, his hands steady despite the tears that ran unchecked down his face. The preacher spoke of eternal rest and God's mysterious ways, but the words seemed to blow away on the wind like dust. As the mourners departed, Caleb remained by the grave on the hill overlooking their cabin. He stayed there until the sun touched the peaks and the sky turned the color of blood, thinking about morning coffee and Sarah's laughter and the child who would never be born. When the stars came out, he finally walked home to the empty cabin and tried to figure out how a man was supposed to live when half of his soul was missing. 6 months passed like a fever dream. Caleb McGraw aged years in those weeks, his hair showing streaks of premature gray and his eyes taking on the hollow look of a man who had seen too much sorrow. The townspeople of Redemption Creek whispered that grief had driven him half mad. They weren't entirely wrong. He let the cattle wander where they pleased, barely managing to keep them from straying too far into the high country where the wolves would take them. The cabin fell into disrepair. Shutters hung crooked. The front steps sagged, and weeds grew tall around the foundation where Sarah's flower garden had once bloomed. Caleb ate when he remembered to, slept when exhaustion finally claimed him, and spent his days riding the boundaries of his property like a man searching for something he knew he would never find. Doc Morrison rode out twice to check on him, bringing supplies and stern lectures about taking care of himself. But Caleb barely responded to his presence. Mrs. Henderson from the general store sent her eldest boy, Tommy, with baskets of food that mostly went untouched. The preacher came calling once, speaking of God's plan and the comfort of faith, but Caleb had asked him to leave and never come back. God's plan, Caleb had said, standing in his doorway with wild eyes and 3 days of stubble on his jaw, was to take a woman who never hurt a soul and throw her off a cliff while she was carrying our child. You can keep that kind of plan to yourself, preacher. After that, most folks left him alone. The November storm came without warning, as they often did in that high country. Caleb had been sitting by his dying fire, staring at nothing and nursing a cup of whiskey that had gone cold hours ago, when the wind began to howl like something alive and furious. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder shook the cabin's frame. He should have checked on the horses in the barn, should have secured the loose shutter that had been banging all evening. But Caleb couldn't summon the energy to care about anything beyond the 4 walls that enclosed his misery. The knocking came just after midnight, 3 sharp raps that were barely audible above the storm's fury. Caleb thought at first it was just the wind playing tricks, branches scraping against the cabin walls. But then it came again, more insistent this time, and definitely human. He rose from his chair slowly, his joints stiff from sitting too long in the cold. Probably Doc Morrison, he thought, come to check on him again despite the weather, or maybe one of the Henderson boys with news from town. Caleb unbolted the door and pulled it open, squinting against the driving rain. The woman standing on his porch was a ghost. She swayed on her feet, soaked to the skin and shivering so violently her teeth chattered like castanets. Her auburn hair, darker now from the rain, hung in wet ropes around a face that was thinner than he remembered, marked by exhaustion and something that might have been fear. But the eyes were the same, those green eyes that had haunted his dreams for 6 months. Sarah. The word came out as a whisper, barely audible above the storm. She looked up at him then, and her mouth moved soundlessly for a moment before she found her voice. "Caleb," she said, and then her knees buckled. He caught her as she fell, his arms closing around her familiar weight, and for a moment he was certain he was dreaming. But her skin was cold and real beneath his hands, her heartbeat rapid and fluttering against his chest. She was wearing a man's shirt, several sizes too large, the fabric torn and stained with mud and what looked like blood. Her feet were bare and cut, her legs scratched from running through brush. "Don't let them find me," she whispered against his neck, her voice ragged with exhaustion. "Please, Caleb, don't let them find me." He lifted her in his arms and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. The rational part of his mind, the part that hadn't been pickled in grief and whiskey for 6 months, was screaming questions. Where had she been? How was she alive? Whose shirt was she wearing? But the larger part of him, the part that had been dying by degrees since that terrible May evening, was simply grateful to hold his wife again. He set her down gently in front of the fireplace and began building up the flames with shaking hands. Sarah sat huddled on the hearth, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the growing fire as if she had never seen anything so wonderful. When Caleb reached out to touch her face, she flinched away from his hand. "It's me," he said softly. "It's Caleb. You're safe now." She nodded, but didn't look at him. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm not the same." That much was obvious. The Sarah he had buried in his heart 6 months ago had been quick to laugh, eager to touch and be touched, comfortable in her own skin. This woman seemed to exist inside a shell of invisible armor, as if she expected blow to fall at any moment. Caleb heated water and helped her wash, his hands gentle as he cleaned the cuts on her feet and bandaged them with strips torn from one of his old shirts. She submitted to his care passively, like a wounded animal that has exhausted its ability to fight. When he brought her clean clothes, one of her own dresses that he had never been able to bring himself to pack away, she changed in front of the fire without apparent awareness of her nakedness. The sight of her body, thinner now and marked with fading bruises, made something twist painfully in his chest. "Sarah," he said when she was dressed and sitting by the fire with a cup of hot coffee in her hands. "Where have you been? We thought you were dead." She was quiet for so long that he began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat and distant, as if she were recounting something that had happened to someone else. "They took me," she said. "3 of them. I think maybe 4. I couldn't see their faces. They put a bag over my head and tied my hands." She paused to sip the coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "They kept me in a place underground, like a root cellar, but deeper. Stone walls, no windows." Caleb felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. "Who were they? Did you see?" "I was there for, I don't know how long. Weeks, maybe months. It was always dark." Sarah's voice remained eerily calm, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the coffee cup. "And then one day, someone else came. A man. He fought with them. There was shooting and screaming, and when it was over, he said he was there to help me." She fell silent again, staring into the fire. Caleb waited, afraid to push too hard, afraid she would retreat back into whatever dark place her mind had gone to survive. "His name was Boone," she continued finally. "He said he'd been tracking the men who took me, that he was some kind of lawman. He brought me to his cabin up in the mountains, said I was safe now, that he'd take care of me." The way she said those last words made Caleb's stomach clench with dread. "But he didn't," Sarah went on, her voice growing smaller. "Take care of me. I mean, not the way he said he would. He said I belonged to him now, that he'd saved me, so I owed him. He kept me locked up just like the others had, only—" She shuddered. "Only he wanted different things from me." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "Sarah!" "I can't," she said quickly, looking at him for the first time since she'd begun her story. "I can't talk about that part. Not yet. Maybe not ever." He nodded, swallowing the questions that burned in his throat. "How did you get away?" "He went into town 3 days ago. Left me chained to the wall." Her mouth twisted in what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "But he made a mistake. The chain was old, rusted. I worked at it until it broke, and then I ran. I've been walking ever since, trying to find my way home." Home. She had called this place home, despite everything that had happened, despite the months of captivity, and God only knew what else. She had found her way back to him. "The baby," Caleb said quietly, dreading the answer. "Sarah, were you, when they took you, you were gone," she whispered, her composure finally cracking. I lost our baby in that place, in the dark, alone, with no one to—" She doubled over as if in physical pain, great racking sobs shaking her thin frame. Caleb gathered her into his arms then, holding her as she wept for the child they would never know, for the months of darkness and fear, for the innocence that could never be recovered. His own tears fell silently into her hair as he rocked her gently, whispering meaningless words of comfort. Later, when the storm had passed and Sarah had cried herself into exhaustion, she lay curled against him on the narrow bed, her head on his chest. Caleb stared up at the ceiling, his mind churning. She was alive, against all odds, against reason itself. His wife was alive and back in his arms, but she was also damaged in ways he couldn't fully comprehend, carrying scars that might never heal. "Sarah," he said softly, not sure if she was awake. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't. I'm sorry I'm not—" "Don't," he said fiercely. "Don't apologize. None of this was your fault. You hear me? None of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if I can be a wife to you again. Caleb, I don't know if I can be anything to anyone." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "You're alive," he said. "That's all that matters. Everything else. We'll figure it out as we go." But even as he spoke the words, Caleb wondered if either of them truly believed they could find their way back to what they'd had before. The woman in his arms felt like Sarah, smelled like Sarah, but she was changed in fundamental ways. And he was changed too. 6 months of believing her dead had carved something out of him that might never grow back. Outside, the storm was breaking up, patches of starlight showing through the racing clouds. Caleb held his wife and listened to her breathing slowly even out as she fell asleep, and tried not to think about the man's shirt she had been wearing when she came home, or the way she flinched from his touch, or the haunted look in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was alive. She was home. For now, that would have to be enough. News traveled fast in Redemption Creek, faster than wildfire in dry grass. By the time the sun crested the eastern hills, word had already reached town that Sarah McGraw had returned from the dead. Tommy Henderson, who'd been delivering supplies to the Fletcher Ranch, claimed he'd seen smoke rising from the McGraw chimney at first light, smoke that hadn't been there in months. Old Henrik Anderson swore he'd spotted 2 figures moving around the cabin when he'd ridden past on his way to check his trap lines. By noon, the whispers had started. "Ain't natural," muttered Ezra Collins outside the barber shop, stroking his gray beard. "Woman falls off Devil's Drop. She don't come walking back 6 months later like nothing happened." "Maybe she never fell," suggested Martha Whitman, the storekeeper's wife. Her voice pitched low, but carrying clearly across the dusty street. "Maybe she ran off with some man, and now she's come crawling back with her tail between her legs." "Or maybe," said Jake Morrison, "Doc's youngest son. It ain't really her at all. Could be some demon wearing her face, come to steal souls." The speculation grew more wild and vicious with each telling. By evening, half the town was convinced that Sarah McGraw was either a fallen woman, a witch, or something worse entirely. Mayor Theodore Blackwood, a thin man with ambitious eyes and a politician's smile, decided the situation required official intervention. The next morning, he rode out to the McGraw place, accompanied by Doc Morrison, Preacher Samuel Hayes, and Sheriff Ned Coleman. They found Caleb splitting wood behind the cabin, his axe biting deep into the pine logs with more force than was strictly necessary. "Morning, Caleb," the mayor called out, dismounting from his horse. "Heard you had some unexpected company." Caleb straightened slowly, the axe handle gripped tight in his calloused hands. His eyes, which had been dead for months, now burned with a dangerous light. "She's my wife, Blackwood, not company. Now, son," Doc Morrison said gently. "Nobody's disputing that, but folks are concerned. A woman doesn't just come back from the dead without some explanation." "She wasn't dead," Caleb said flatly. "She was taken, held against her will. Now she's home where she belongs." Sheriff Coleman, a heavy-set man with a badge that had seen better days, spat into the dirt. That's quite a story. McGraw, mind if we hear it from the lady herself? Before Caleb could answer, the cabin door opened and Sarah emerged. She looked fragile in the morning light, wearing one of her old dresses that now hung loose on her diminished frame. But she held her head high as she walked to stand beside her husband. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, "I understand you have questions." The preacher stepped forward, his black coat dusty from the ride. "Mrs. McGraw, if indeed you are Mrs. McGraw, the people of Redemption Creek are troubled by your resurrection. They need to know that you're still a God-fearing Christian woman, untainted by whatever evil you may have encountered." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I am who I've always been. Preacher Hayes, no more, no less." "Then you won't mind telling us where you've been these past 6 months?" Mayor Blackwood pressed. "The whole town mourned your passing. We deserve to know the truth." For the next hour, they questioned her relentlessly. Where exactly had she been held? Who were her captors? How had she escaped? Sarah answered as best she could, her voice growing smaller with each probing question. But her responses only seemed to fuel their suspicions. "You can't remember their faces?" Sheriff Coleman asked skeptically. 6 months with these men and you can't give us one useful detail?" "It was dark," Sarah whispered. "They kept me in the dark." "And this Boone fellow," the mayor continued. "You say he rescued you but then held you prisoner himself. Seems mighty convenient that you can't tell us where to find him." Caleb stepped closer to his wife, his presence protective and threatening in equal measure. "She's told you what she remembers. That's enough." But it wasn't enough for the men of Redemption Creek, and certainly not enough for their wives. As word of the questioning spread, the rumors grew more poisonous. "She was with the Apaches," whispered Clara Fletcher to her sewing circle. "Look how dark her skin's gotten. Mark my words, she's been living as a savage." "I heard she was working in one of those houses in Denver," added Millicent Barnes, her voice dripping with false concern. "Selling herself to miners and railroad men. That's why she can't look any decent woman in the eye." The cruelest rumors suggested that Sarah had orchestrated her own disappearance, running off with a lover and returning only when he'd tired of her. The evidence, they said, was obvious. No respectable woman would survive 6 months of captivity and come back looking so damaged. 3 days after the official questioning, Caleb rode into town for supplies and found the atmosphere thick with hostility. Conversation stopped when he entered Whitman's store. Children stared at him with wide, fearful eyes. When he approached the counter, Ezra Whitman wouldn't meet his gaze. "Need flour, bacon, and coffee beans," Caleb said quietly. Whitman gathered the supplies with obvious reluctance. "That'll be $8, he said, naming a price nearly double what it should have been. "That seems high, Ezra." The storekeeper's face flushed red. "Times are hard, McGraw, and some customers are riskier than others." Caleb placed exact change on the counter, his movements deliberate and controlled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Means a man who'd keep a woman like that under his roof might not be the most reliable sort." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. "A woman like what?" "Come on, Caleb," Whitman said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "You know what folks are saying. Maybe she was taken, maybe she wasn't. But either way, she's been used. Damaged goods. Any decent man would send her on her way." Caleb's fist connected with Whitman's jaw before he'd consciously decided to swing. The storekeeper went down hard, knocking over a display of canned goods as he fell. Several customers scrambled for the door as Caleb stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving with rage. "You ever," Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet, "speak about my wife that way again, and I'll kill you. That's not a threat, Ezra. It's a promise." He gathered his supplies and walked out, leaving Whitman groaning on the floor and the remaining customers in stunned silence. Word of the fight spread quickly, dividing the town even further. Some folks, particularly the younger men who remembered Sarah's kindness and Caleb's steady character, began to question the cruel gossip. but others saw the violence as proof that the McGraws had brought something dark and dangerous back to Redemption Creek. That evening, Caleb sat on his porch cleaning his rifle while Sarah tended her small vegetable garden. The work seemed to calm her. The simple act of coaxing life from the earth providing a kind of peace that nothing else could offer. She had insisted on replanting it despite the late season, saying she needed to feel useful again. "The children threw stones at me today," she said without looking up from the tomato plants she was staking. "When I walked past the schoolhouse." Caleb's hand stilled on the rifle. "Which children?" "It doesn't matter." Sarah brushed dirt from her hands and sat down beside him. "They're just repeating what they hear at home." "It matters to me." She was quiet for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the western peaks. "Do you ever wonder if they're right? If I should have just stayed gone?" "No." The word came out harder than he'd intended. "Don't you ever think that. Don't you dare." "But look what I've brought back with me. Look how they treat you now because of me." Caleb set the rifle aside and took her hands in his. They were rougher than they'd been before, marked by months of hardship, but they were still the hands he'd fallen in love with. "Sarah, listen to me. I don't give a damn what they think. You're my wife. You're home. That's all that matters." She leaned against his shoulder, and for a moment they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. But the peace was fragile, brittle as thin ice, and they both knew it couldn't last. That night, Sarah woke screaming from another nightmare. Caleb held her while she sobbed against his chest, her body racked with memories she couldn't or wouldn't share. When the tears finally stopped, she looked up at him with those haunted green eyes. "I dream about the dark," she whispered. "About his hands on me. About the sound of chains." Caleb's jaw clenched. "Sarah, I know you want to ask. About what he did to me. What they all did." Her voice was steady now, matter of fact. "Maybe someday I'll be able to tell you. But not now. Right now. I just need you to hold me and tell me I'm safe." So he did, whispering words of love and protection into the darkness while the wind howled around their cabin like something alive and hungry. And if his own tears fell silently into her hair, if his heart broke a little more with each shuddering breath she took, he kept that pain locked away where she couldn't see it. Outside, the town of Redemption Creek slept fitfully, its dreams poisoned by suspicion and fear. In the morning, there would be more whispers, more cruel stares, more walls of silence that parted reluctantly when the McGraws passed by. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Caleb held his wife and tried to pretend that love alone would be enough to heal them both. He was beginning to understand that it might not be. Some wounds went too deep for love to reach. Some damage couldn't be undone with gentle words and patient hands. Still, he would try. Whatever it cost him, whatever the town thought or said or did, he would hold on to this broken, precious woman and help her find her way back to the light. It was all he knew how to do. It was all he had left to give. The weeks that followed brought a harsh education in the cruelty of small-town judgment. Sarah made her first tentative venture back into Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning in late November, walking beside Caleb's horse as he rode slowly down Main Street. She had insisted on coming, despite his protests, saying she couldn't hide on the ranch forever like some shameful secret. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Mrs. Henderson yanked her youngest son behind her skirts when Sarah passed, as if proximity to the returned woman might contaminate the boy. The blacksmith's wife, Ruth Garrison, crossed herself and muttered what sounded suspiciously like a prayer for protection from evil spirits. Most painful of all, the children, the same children Sarah had once helped with their letters when she worked for Doc Morrison's wife, stared at her with a mixture of fear and fascination before breaking into whispered chants. "Ghost woman, ghost woman, came back from the dead," they sang in the cruel way that only children could manage. "Ghost woman, better off dead instead." One particularly brave or foolish boy of about 10 picked up a stone from the street and hurled it at Sarah's feet. It struck close enough to send dust across her worn boots. And suddenly, half a dozen other children were following suit, their projectiles growing bolder with each throw. "Witch!" shouted little Mary Fletcher, her face twisted with the righteous anger of the very young. "My mama says you're a witch who sold her soul to the devil." Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the street, stones bouncing around her feet, while the children's parents watched from doorways and windows, making no move to stop the assault. The look on her face was heartbreaking, not anger or fear, but a terrible resignation, as if she had expected nothing better and was merely having her worst suspicions confirmed. Caleb was off his horse in an instant, his boots hitting the ground with a sound like thunder. "That's enough!" he roared, and his voice carried such fury that even the bravest child took several steps backward. "The next person, man, woman, or child, who throws so much as a pebble at my wife will answer to me personally, and I guarantee you won't like my answers." Mayor Blackwood emerged from his office, his politician's smile nowhere in evidence. "Now see here, McGraw, these children are just expressing their natural what?" Caleb advanced on the smaller man, his hand resting meaningfully on the pistol at his hip. "Their natural right to assault an innocent woman? Is that what you're about to say, Theodore?" The mayor's face went pale. "Of course not. I was merely suggesting that perhaps Mrs. McGraw might be more comfortable if she avoided town for a while longer, until people have had time to adjust." "Adjust to what? To the fact that my wife survived something that would have killed most men? To the fact that she fought her way home against odds that would make your blood run cold?" Caleb's voice carried clearly down the street, and Sarah could see faces appearing in windows, drawn by the confrontation. "Or are you suggesting she should adjust to being treated like a leper for the crime of refusing to die quietly?" Sarah touched his arm gently. "Caleb, please, let's just go home." He looked down at her, seeing the exhaustion in her green eyes, the way her shoulders had curved inward as if trying to make herself smaller, invisible. The fight went out of him all at once, replaced by a protective tenderness that was somehow more dangerous than his rage had been. "All right," he said quietly, "but hear me, all of you." His gaze swept the street, taking in every watching face. "Sarah McGraw is my wife. She's a good woman who's been through hell and back. Anyone who can't see that, anyone who wants to treat her with anything less than the respect she deserves, can consider themselves no friend of mine, and enemies of mine don't tend to prosper in this territory." The ride home was silent, except for the sound of the horse's hooves and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Sarah walked beside the horse with her head down, her steps mechanical, as if she were concentrating on nothing more complex than putting one foot in front of the other. When they reached the cabin, she went straight to the small room that had been meant as a nursery and closed the door behind her. Caleb found her there an hour later, sitting on the floor with her back against the unfinished wall, staring at nothing. The room still smelled faintly of fresh pine shavings and hope, a scent that now seemed to mock them both. "I was going to paint this room yellow," Sarah said without looking at him. "Yellow, because it would have worked for either a boy or a girl. I had it all planned out, a little rocking chair by the window, shelves for books and toys. I was going to make curtains with tiny flowers on them." Caleb settled beside her on the floor, careful not to crowd her. "We can still do that, someday." She turned to look at him then, and her smile was the saddest thing he'd ever seen. "Can we? After what happened to me, what was done to me, do you think God would trust us with another child? Sarah, I lost our baby in that place. Caleb, in the dark, with no one to help me, nowhere clean to. I held him in my hands. He was so small, so perfect." Her voice broke, but no tears came. It was as if she had cried herself dry in the months of captivity. "I buried him under a tree behind that cabin, said a prayer over him, and promised him that somehow, someday, I'd come home and tell his father what a beautiful baby he was." Caleb felt something die inside his chest. Him? A boy. He looked like you, the same strong chin, the same dark hair. I named him Thomas, after your father. She leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. I dream about him sometimes. Wonder what he would have looked like when he smiled. What his voice would have sounded like when he said his first word. They sat in silence for a long time, mourning the child they would never know, the future that had been stolen from them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. Winter was coming early again, and with it would come the long, dark months when the cabin felt more like a prison than a home. That night, Caleb lay awake listening to Sarah's breathing, studying the familiar outline of her profile in the moonlight that filtered through their bedroom window. She was thinner than she'd been before, her cheekbones more prominent, her collarbones sharp beneath her nightgown. But she was still beautiful to him, still the woman he'd fallen in love with outside Whitman's store 2 years ago. The difference was in her eyes, in the careful way she moved through the world now, as if she were constantly braced for the next blow. She smiled sometimes, when she was working in her garden or when she caught sight of a hawk circling overhead. But the smiles never seemed to reach those green eyes that had once sparkled with mischief and joy. "I know you're awake," she said softly, her voice barely disturbing the quiet of the room. "Can't sleep. Neither can I." She turned to face him, her hand finding his beneath the quilts. "Caleb, I need to tell you something. About the shirt." He had wondered about that man's shirt she'd been wearing when she came home. Had wondered, but hadn't dared to ask. Now, in the safety of their darkened bedroom, she was ready to share another piece of her story. "His name was Jeremiah Boone," she said, her fingers tracing patterns on the back of his hand. "I remember that much now. He had pale eyes and hair the color of straw, and he smelled like tobacco and other things. Worse things." Caleb's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. "He said he'd killed the men who took me to rescue me. Said I belonged to him now, that I should be grateful." Her voice was steady, clinical, as if she were describing something that had happened to a stranger. "He kept me chained in his cabin for months. The shirt, it was his. He made me wear it because my dress had been damaged. He said it marked me as his property. Sarah, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Her grip on his hand tightened. "Because if I don't say it now, I never will. And you need to know. You need to understand what you're choosing when you choose to stay with me." She told him about the cabin in the high country, about the chains and the darkness and the fear that had been her constant companion. She spoke of Boone's casual cruelty, his belief that having saved her gave him the right to use her however he pleased. She described her escape, the rust-weakened link in the chain, the long walk through unfamiliar wilderness, the terror that he might find her before she reached home. When she finished, they lay together in the quiet darkness, and Caleb understood that she had given him a gift more precious than gold, her trust. She had shared her deepest shame and fear with him, had made herself vulnerable in a way that must have cost her dearly. "I love you," he said finally, the words inadequate but necessary. "None of what happened changes that. None of it was your fault." "Sometimes I feel like I'm still there," she whispered. "Still chained to that wall, still waiting for him to come back. Sometimes when you touch me, even tenderly, I forget for a moment where I am." Caleb turned onto his side, careful to move slowly, to give her time to pull away if she needed to. When she didn't flinch, he cupped her face gently in his hands. "Then we'll go slow," he said, "as slow as you need. And if you need me to stop, ever, for any reason, you just say so." She nodded, tears finally coming, sliding silently down her cheeks to pool against the pillow. "I want to be your wife again. I want to feel normal, but I don't know if I remember how." "Then we'll figure it out together," he said, and leaned down to kiss her forehead with infinite gentleness. "We'll learn together. There's no rush. Sarah, we have all the time in the world." But even as he spoke the words, Caleb knew they weren't entirely true. Time was the one thing they might not have. Somewhere out in the wilderness, a man named Jeremiah Boone was probably wondering what had happened to his captive. And judging by Sarah's description of him, He didn't sound like the type of man who would simply accept the loss and move on. Still, for tonight, they had this: the quiet intimacy of shared secrets, the fragile beginning of trust being rebuilt, the promise of healing that might, with patience and love, eventually come. It would have to be enough. It was all they had. Winter had settled over the high country like a heavy blanket when the federal marshal arrived in Redemption Creek. Marshal William Carson was a tall, weathered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darker nature. He wore his authority quietly but unmistakably, and when he walked into Murphy's saloon that December evening, the usual crowd of drinkers and card players fell silent. "I'm looking for information about a man named Jeremiah Boone," Carson announced, his voice carrying clearly through the smoky room. "Known associate of the Caldwell gang. Wanted in connection with multiple kidnappings and worse. Word is he's been operating in these parts." Sheriff Coleman, who had been nursing a whiskey at the far end of the bar, straightened nervously. "What kind of worse? Marshal?" Carson reached into his coat and produced a folded wanted poster. Spreading it out on the bar, the drawing showed a lean-faced man with pale eyes and straw-colored hair, exactly as Sarah had described him. Human trafficking, abduction of women for sale to mining camps and railroad crews. At least 6 confirmed victims in Colorado alone, probably more across 3 territories. Mayor Blackwood leaned forward to study the poster, his politician's mind already working. "What's the bounty?" $500, dead or alive. But I'd prefer to take him breathing if possible. The families of his victims deserve to know what happened to their daughters. Doc Morrison, who had been playing cards in the corner, spoke up quietly. "Marshal, there's something you should know. We might have one of those victims right here in town." Carson's attention sharpened immediately. "Go on." Sarah McGraw disappeared last spring. Came back 6 months later with a story about being held captive by a man matching Boone's description, name and all. The marshal was already reaching for his hat. "Where can I find her?" An hour later, Carson sat in the McGraw's small parlor, his notebook open on his knee, while Sarah perched nervously on the edge of the sofa. Caleb stood protectively behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder. The marshal's questions were thorough but respectful, and Sarah found herself able to speak more freely than she had with the town officials. "The cabin was built into a hillside," she said, her voice growing stronger as she recalled details. "Maybe a day's hard ride north of here, in the high country where the pine trees grow thick. There was a creek running behind it, and you could see 3 peaks from the front door, one shaped like a broken tooth." Carson nodded, making notes. "That matches what we know about his usual territory. What about inside the cabin?" Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. "One room, mostly. Stone fireplace on the north wall, a table made from a tree stump, and chains built into the walls." "How many sets of chains?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had assumed she was Boone's only victim, but the marshal's tone suggested otherwise. I don't know. I only saw the ones he used on me. Mrs. McGraw," Carson said gently. "I know this is difficult, but I need you to understand something. You may be the only person who ever escaped from Jeremiah Boone alive. Your testimony could help us put him away permanently. And more importantly, it might help us find other victims." Caleb's hand tightened on Sarah's shoulder. "What are you asking her to do?" "I'm asking her to come to Denver with me, to testify before a federal judge. Help us build a case that will see Boone hang for his crimes." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally looked up, her green eyes were filled with a resolution that reminded Caleb of the woman she'd been before the darkness took her. "If it will help stop him," she said quietly, "I'll do it." The journey to Denver took 3 days through snow-choked mountain passes. Sarah rode between Caleb and Marshal Carson, wrapped in a heavy coat and buffalo robe, her face pale but determined. They stopped each night at way stations or friendly ranches, and Carson used the time to prepare Sarah for what she would face in court. The defense attorney will try to discredit you, he warned as they sat around a fire on the second night. He'll suggest you went willingly, that you're lying to protect your reputation. Can you handle that? Sarah stared into the flames, remembering the children throwing stones, the whispers and cruel stares in Redemption Creek. I've been handling it for months. Marshal, at least in court. There will be rules. But when they reached Denver and Sarah saw the size of the courthouse, the crowds of people, the newspaper reporters who had gotten wind of the story, her courage nearly failed her. She stood on the courthouse steps, trembling despite her warm coat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was about to do. I can't, she whispered to Caleb. All those people staring at me, judging me. You can, he said firmly, taking her hands in his. You're the strongest person I know. Sarah McGraw. You survived 6 months in hell and found your way home. This is just another kind of wilderness, and you're going to walk through it the same way you walked through the mountains, one step at a time. The trial lasted 2 days. Sarah's testimony was devastating in its quiet detail, delivered in a voice that shook but never broke. She described her abduction, the months of captivity, the fear that had been her constant companion. When the defense attorney tried to suggest she had been a willing participant, Sarah looked him directly in the eye. Sir, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, no woman willingly chooses to live in chains. No woman chooses to be treated like property, to have her freedom stolen and her dignity trampled. If you believe that any woman would choose such a life, then you understand nothing about women at all. The courtroom erupted in applause, and the judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. But the trial's aftermath brought fresh horrors. While Sarah was testifying in Denver, someone had ridden out to the McGraw Ranch and set fire to the barn. The building was a total loss, along with most of their winter hay and 3 of Caleb's best horses. Spray painted across the side of the cabin in crude letters were the words, "Whore Lover." When they returned home to find the destruction, Sarah stood in the snowy yard staring at the blackened ruins of the barn, her face expressionless. Caleb expected tears, rage, despair, anything but the terrible calm that had settled over her features. They want us to leave, she said finally. We're not going anywhere, Caleb replied, but even he could hear the exhaustion in his own voice. That night, Sarah sat at their kitchen table with paper and pen, writing with painstaking care. When Caleb asked what she was doing, she showed him the letter, addressed to her parents in Ohio, the first contact she'd had with them since coming west. Dear Mother and Father, it began. I know you must have wondered what became of me. I am writing to tell you that I am alive. I am married to a good man, and I am trying to rebuild my life after a period of great trial. The letter was 3 pages long, honest about her struggles without going into painful detail. When she finished, her hand was shaking from the effort, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. Why now? Caleb asked. Because running away didn't work the first time, Sarah said. Because I'm tired of being ashamed of things that weren't my fault. Because if we're going to make a stand here, I need to know who I really am again. Word of the trial had reached Redemption Creek before they returned, and the town's reaction was mixed. Some folks, shamed by the federal marshal's respect for Sarah and the newspaper accounts of her brave testimony, began to reconsider their harsh judgment. Mrs. Henderson stopped by with a basket of food and a mumbled apology. Doc Morrison's wife, Anna, came to offer her services as a midwife when the time comes, a kindness that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. But others remained convinced that Sarah had brought shame on their community. The barn burning was just the beginning. They found their well water poisoned with salt. Someone shot one of their remaining horses. Rocks were thrown through their windows on 2 separate occasions. It's Jeremiah Boone who should be ashamed, Anna Morrison said fiercely one afternoon as she helped Sarah clean up the broken glass from their latest attack. Not you, dear, never you. Sarah managed a wan smile. Tell that to the good folks of Redemption Creek. Some of them are starting to listen, Anna assured her. Change comes slow to places like this, but it does come. You just have to be patient. But patience was becoming a luxury they couldn't afford. The harassment was escalating, and Caleb was spending more time watching the perimeter of their property than tending to what remained of their stock. They were living under siege, and everyone knew it couldn't last much longer. The breaking point came on a bitter February morning when Sarah ventured into town to buy supplies at Whitman's store. She had steeled herself for the usual cold reception, the whispered comments and hostile stares. What she hadn't expected was to find Ezra Whitman's teenage son, Billy, waiting for her with a rope in his hands and murder in his eyes. "My PA says you're a demon," the boy snarled, backing Sarah against the store's wall. "Says you've cursed this whole town with your evil. Maybe it's time someone did something about it." Sarah looked at the rope, at the boy's twisted features, and felt something shift inside her chest. She had survived Jeremiah Boone. She had survived months of captivity, the loss of her child, the town's judgment, and countless nights of terror. She would not be cowed by a frightened boy with more hate than sense. "Billy Whitman," she said, her voice deadly calm. "If you think that rope scares me after what I've been through, you're even more foolish than you look. Now get out of my way before I show you exactly what this demon is capable of." The boy hesitated, confused by her lack of fear. In that moment of uncertainty, Marshal Carson appeared around the corner of the building, his hand resting on his pistol. "Problem here, folks?" he asked mildly. Billy dropped the rope and fled. Carson watched him go, then turned to Sarah with something that might have been approval in his steel-gray eyes. "Heard you testified real well in Denver. Mrs. McGraw. Jury convicted Boone on all counts. He'll hang within the month." Sarah nodded, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying suddenly lift from her shoulders. "Good. That's good. Thought you should know. We found evidence of at least 12 other victims at his cabin. Young women who weren't as lucky as you, or as strong." Carson tipped his hat. "What you did, speaking up, it mattered. It mattered to their families, and it'll matter to any woman who might have been his next victim." As the marshal rode away, Sarah stood in the street feeling something she hadn't experienced in almost a year: pride. Not the bitter satisfaction of survival, but genuine pride in having done something difficult and necessary and right. She was still Sarah McGraw. She was still a woman who had endured unspeakable things, but she was also, she realized, a woman who had fought back, a woman who had refused to let evil win. It was a beginning. The news of Jeremiah Boone's execution should have brought peace to the McGraw household, but instead, it seemed to stir something darker in the shadows of the high country. 3 weeks after Marshal Carson delivered word of the hanging, a stranger rode into Redemption Creek, leading a string of fine horses and claiming to be a traveling trader named James Walker. Walker was a nondescript man of medium height with brown hair and forgettable features, the kind of person who could disappear into a crowd without effort. He set up camp on the outskirts of town and spent his days trading horses with local ranchers. Always polite, always fair in his dealings, always asking casual questions about the area and its inhabitants. "Fine country you've got here," he told Henrik Anderson while examining a sorrel gelding. "Hear there was some trouble recently with that Boone fellow. Terrible business, preying on innocent women like that." Anderson, pleased to find someone willing to listen to his opinions, launched into a detailed account of recent events. McGraw woman was lucky to escape. I'll give her that. Course, some folks still wonder exactly what happened up there in that cabin, if you know what I mean. Walker nodded sympathetically. Hard thing for a woman to go through. Must have changed her considerably. Oh, it did. She's not the same person who disappeared last spring, that's certain. Jumpy as a cat in a thunderstorm. From what I hear, McGraw's devoted to her, though, man do anything for that wife of his. The stranger filed away every piece of information, building a careful picture of his targets. He learned their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He discovered that Caleb rode into town every Thursday for supplies, that Sarah spent her mornings tending the vegetable garden she'd planted behind the cabin, that they lived quietly and kept mostly to themselves since the barn burning. What Walker didn't tell anyone was that his real name was Marcus Boone, and the man they'd hanged in Denver had been his younger brother. Marcus had been tracking Jeremiah for months, following the trail of destruction his brother had left across 3 territories. He'd arrived at the mountain cabin 2 days after Sarah's escape to find his brother's body riddled with bullets and a federal marshal's badge on the table. Jeremiah had tried to resist arrest and died in the gunfight that followed. The woman who had testified against his brother, who had helped send him to the gallows, was going to pay for that betrayal. But Marcus Boone was a patient man. Unlike his impulsive younger brother, he would wait for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to take what was owed him. That opportunity came on a Thursday in early March, when Caleb rode to town as usual for supplies, leaving Sarah alone at the ranch. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, enjoying the first warm day after a bitter winter, when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the north. Sarah looked up to see a lone rider leading several horses, and her blood turned to ice when she recognized the face beneath the battered hat. It wasn't Jeremiah. This man was older, heavier, with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The same pale eyes, the same thin lips, the same predatory smile that had haunted her nightmares for months. "Well, well," Marcus Boone said, dismounting with casual ease. "The famous Mrs. Sarah McGraw. You're quite the celebrity in these parts, aren't you? My brother told me all about you before he died." Sarah backed toward the cabin, her mind racing. Caleb wouldn't be home for hours. The nearest neighbor was miles away. She was alone with a man who had every reason to want her dead. "I don't know who you are," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Name's Marcus Boone. Jeremiah was my baby brother." He pulled a length of rope from his saddlebag, testing its strength with practiced movements. "You remember Jeremiah, don't you? Man you sent to the gallows with your lies?" "They weren't lies," Sarah said fiercely, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Your brother was a monster who deserved to hang." Marcus's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Maybe so, but he was family, and family looks out for family. Time someone taught you the consequences of crossing a Boone." Sarah turned and ran for the cabin, but Marcus was younger and faster. He caught her arm just as she reached the door, spinning her around with brutal efficiency. She fought him with desperate strength, kicking and clawing and screaming, but he was too strong. Within minutes, he had her hands bound and was dragging her toward his horse. "Your husband's going to come looking for you," she gasped, still struggling against the ropes. "I'm counting on it," Marcus replied, lifting her onto his saddle. "This time, though, things are going to end different. This time, I'm going to make sure there's no happy reunion." The ride into the mountains was a nightmare of familiar terror. Sarah found herself retracing the same paths she had walked 6 months earlier during her escape from Jeremiah, heading back toward the high country where the pines grew thick and the law rarely ventured. But Marcus wasn't taking her to his brother's cabin. Instead, he led her deeper into the wilderness, to a place she had never seen before. The cave was hidden in a cluster of massive boulders, its entrance barely wide enough for a horse and rider. Inside, it opened into a larger chamber that had obviously been used before. There were provisions stacked against one wall, bedrolls and cooking gear, and most ominously, iron rings driven deep into the stone walls. "Welcome to my home away from home," Marcus said, dismounting and dragging Sarah down after him. "Used to be a hideout for the James gang, back in the day. Now it's going to be your tomb." He chained her to one of the iron rings, the familiar weight of the shackles around her wrists bringing back every terrifying memory from her months of captivity. But this time was different. This time, Sarah McGraw was not the same frightened woman who had been taken from her garden a year ago. "He'll find me," she said, meeting Marcus's gaze without flinching. "Caleb will track you down, and when he does, he'll kill you." "Let him try," Marcus laughed. "I've got something special planned for your loving husband. See, I've been watching you folks for weeks now. I know his habits, his weaknesses. I know exactly how much he loves his precious wife. He began setting snares and traps around the cave entrance with methodical precision, fashioning deadly obstacles from rope and sharpened stakes. Sarah watched in growing horror as she realized his plan. Caleb would follow her trail straight into a killing ground designed specifically for him. Meanwhile, Caleb had returned to find the cabin empty and signs of a struggle near the clothesline. The laundry lay scattered in the dirt, and the fresh horse tracks led north toward the high country. His blood ran cold as he read the signs. Sarah had been taken again by someone who knew how to cover his trail. But this time, Caleb McGraw was not the same devastated man who had searched blindly for his missing wife a year ago. This time, he was hunting with purpose and rage that burned like forge fire in his chest. He saddled his best horse, loaded his rifle, and set out on the trail with the patience of a predator stalking prey. The tracks led him through country he knew well, past landmarks that had been seared into his memory during his previous search. But the trail diverged from familiar paths as it climbed higher into the mountains, heading toward a region of broken stone and hidden valleys that few men had ever explored. Caleb followed with grim determination, reading sign like a book. The man he was trailing was good, better than Jeremiah had been, but not good enough to completely hide his passage from someone with Caleb's skill and motivation. Broken twigs, displaced stones, the faint impression of a horse's hoof in soft earth, all told the story of Sarah's abductor's route. As night fell, Caleb made a cold camp in a sheltered draw, not daring to light a fire that might give away his position. He chewed jerky and thought about the woman who had fought her way back from hell to be with him, who had endured months of torment and still found the courage to testify against her captor in open court. Sarah McGraw was the strongest person he had ever known, but she had already suffered more than any human being should have to endure. If this new monster harmed her, if he was too late to save her again. Caleb wasn't sure he would survive the loss a second time, but he would try. He would follow this trail to its end, face whatever waited for him there, and bring his wife home or die in the attempt. It was all he could do. It was all he had left to give. In the cave, Sarah lay awake listening to Marcus Boone's snores and testing the strength of her chains. The iron rings were solid, driven deep into living rock, but the chains themselves showed signs of age and wear. If she could find something to use as leverage, a sharp stone or piece of metal, she might be able to work on the weak links. The thought of escape filled her with a desperate energy. She had survived captivity once before, had found the strength to break free and make her way home through 100 miles of wilderness. She could do it again. She had to do it again, because Caleb was coming for her, and Marcus Boone was waiting for him with murder in his heart. Sarah began to work at her bonds with methodical determination, ignoring the pain as the metal cut into her wrists, focused on nothing but the need to be free when the final confrontation came. This time, she would not be a helpless victim. This time, she would fight. Dawn broke gray and cold over the high country, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of silver and rose. Caleb had been riding since before first light, following a trail that grew fresher with each mile. The signs told him he was closing the distance, horse droppings that were still warm, a broken branch that hadn't yet begun to brown, the lingering scent of tobacco smoke on the morning air. He found the cave by accident, or perhaps by providence. His horse had stepped into a hidden gopher hole and come up lame, forcing Caleb to continue on foot through a maze of granite boulders and wind-carved stone. It was the smell that led him to the right place. Wood smoke and something else, something human and unwashed. Caleb crept closer, his rifle ready, and nearly walked into the first trap. The sharpened stake, angled to catch a man at chest height, was hidden behind a screen of pine boughs and would have killed him instantly if a magpie hadn't chosen that moment to land on the concealed point, alerting him to the danger. From that moment on, he moved like a ghost, testing each step, examining every shadow for signs of deadly intent. Marcus Boone had been thorough. The approach to the cave was a maze of snares, deadfalls, and hidden pits that would have challenged a seasoned Indian scout. But Caleb McGraw had been hunting these mountains since he was old enough to hold a rifle, and he had something Marcus hadn't counted on: the desperate fury of a man fighting for the woman he loved. Inside the cave, Sarah had worked through the night with a shard of broken stone, slowly grinding away at the weakest link in her chain. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from the effort, but she could feel the metal beginning to give way. When she heard Caleb's voice calling her name from somewhere outside the cave, her heart nearly stopped. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Marcus Boone jerked awake, grabbing his rifle as he rolled to his feet. "Right on schedule," he muttered, checking the weapon's load. "Just like I figured. Man so lovesick he walked right into my trap."
"Don't do this,"
Sarah pleaded, pulling desperately at her weakened chain.
"You've got me. That should be enough revenge for your brother."
Marcus laughed, the sound echoing harshly in the stone chamber. "Enough? Lady, killing you would be a mercy compared to what I've got planned. I'm going to make your husband watch while I finish what Jeremiah started. Then I'm going to put a bullet in his brain and leave you both for the wolves." The chain link snapped just as Marcus reached the cave entrance, and Sarah's hand came free with such sudden force that she nearly fell. But she recovered quickly, grabbing a heavy piece of firewood from the pile near the cold hearth. When Marcus turned back to check on her, she was ready. The makeshift club caught him across the back of the head with a solid crack that sent him stumbling forward. His rifle discharged into the cave ceiling, bringing down a shower of rock chips and filling the chamber with acrid smoke. Sarah hit him again, this time across the shoulder, and Marcus Boone went down hard. "Caleb!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the stone passages. "It's a trap! The whole place is rigged!" Outside, Caleb heard her warning and dropped flat just as a deadfall released above his head, sending a massive boulder crashing down where he had been standing moments before. He belly-crawled through the remaining obstacles, using Sarah's voice as a guide, until he could see the cave mouth ahead. Marcus Boone staggered out into the daylight, blood streaming down his face and his rifle clutched in unsteady hands. When he saw Caleb lying prone among the rocks, he raised the weapon with a triumphant snarl. "There you are, McGraw. Come to rescue your precious—" The shot that killed Marcus Boone came not from Caleb's rifle, but from behind him. Marshal William Carson stepped out from behind a boulder, smoking pistol in his hand, his face grim with satisfaction. "Been tracking this one for 2 weeks, Carson said, holstering his weapon. "Ever since we heard his brother had kin in the territory. Figured he might come looking for revenge." Sarah emerged from the cave, battered and bleeding but alive, and Caleb was on his feet in an instant, crushing her against his chest with desperate relief. She felt solid and real in his arms, warm and breathing and safe, and for a moment the world consisted of nothing but her heartbeat against his ribs. "I'm all right," she whispered, though her voice shook with exhaustion and delayed shock. "I'm all right, Caleb. We're both all right." Marshal Carson supervised the burial of Marcus Boone in an unmarked grave among the granite boulders, then escorted the McGraws back to Redemption Creek. Word of the second kidnapping and rescue spread through the town like wildfire. But this time the reaction was different. This time, there was no whispered speculation about Sarah's virtue or suggestions that she had somehow brought the trouble on herself. Instead, there was shame. Shame that they had turned their backs on a woman who had already suffered so much. Shame that their own fear and prejudice had made her ordeal even worse. One by one, the townspeople began to make their quiet apologies. Mrs. Henderson brought a pot of stew and stayed to help Sarah tend her wounded wrists. "I'm sorry," she said simply, her usual stern demeanor replaced by genuine remorse. "We should have stood by you from the beginning. Should have seen what kind of woman you really are." Doc Morrison and his wife Anna came to check Sarah's injuries and ended up staying for dinner, sharing stories and laughter around the McGraw's kitchen table as if the past year of tension had never happened. Even Mayor Blackwood made an appearance, hat in hand, to formally apologize on behalf of the town council. "We'd like to help rebuild your barn," he said awkwardly. "Town's going to take up a collection, Buy you new horses to replace the ones you lost. Least we can do after everything. But the most meaningful reconciliation came from an unexpected source. Billy Whitman, the boy who had threatened Sarah with a rope, appeared at their door one evening with tears streaming down his face and a handful of wildflowers clutched in his dirty fists. "Mrs. McGraw," he stammered.
I'm sorry. I'm real sorry for what I said, what I almost did. My PA. He told me you were evil, but you ain't. You're just hurt, and I made it worse. And I'm sorry."
Sarah knelt down to the boy's level, accepting the crushed flowers with gentle hands. "Thank you, Billy. That takes courage. Apologizing like this. Your mother should be proud." As spring turned to summer, life began to return to normal for the McGraws. The new barn was larger and better built than the old one, raised in a single day by every able-bodied man in Redemption Creek working together. Sarah started teaching letters to the local children, holding classes in the church on Sunday afternoons for youngsters whose parents couldn't afford to send them to the territorial school. She also began helping Dr. Morrison's wife with difficult births and medical emergencies, her steady hands and calm demeanor making her a natural healer. The same strength that had helped her survive months of captivity now served her well in helping others through their own times of crisis. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes since her return was slowly fading, replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. She smiled more often, laughed at Caleb's jokes, and began to speak of the future with something approaching hope. One evening in late July, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Sarah placed Caleb's hand on her still flat belly and smiled at the wonder in his eyes. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "As certain as I can be. Anna Morrison thinks it happened around the time of the second kidnapping, right before Marcus took me. She says sometimes." Sarah paused, searching for the right words. "Sometimes something good can come from something terrible, as if the body knows it needs to create life to balance out all the death." Caleb gathered her into his arms, marveling at the miracle of it. After everything they had endured, after all the loss and pain and darkness, they were being given another chance. Not to replace what they had lost, nothing could ever do that, but to build something new from the ashes of their grief. "What do you want to name him?" Caleb asked. "Or her?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the first stars appear in the deepening sky. "If it's a girl, I'd like to call her Hope, and if it's a boy—" She smiled, and this time the expression reached her eyes. "If it's a boy, I want to name him Thomas, after our first child, the son we never got to know." That night, they made love for the first time since Sarah's return, slowly and gently, with tears of joy and gratitude mixing with their whispered words of love. The woman in Caleb's arms was not the same person who had been taken from their garden more than a year ago, just as he was not the same man who had buried an empty coffin and tried to drink himself to death. They were both changed, marked by suffering and loss in ways that would never fully heal. But they were also stronger, tempered by fire and proven in the crucible of their trials. They had faced the worst that life could offer and had not merely survived. They had found their way back to each other, back to love, back to hope. Outside their cabin, the wind whispered through the pine trees and the mountains stood eternal under the starlight. Patient guardians of the small human dramas played out in their shadows. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to one another across the valleys, their voices wild and free and full of an ancient music that spoke of endurance and survival. Sarah McGraw had come back from the dead twice now, and both times she had chosen life over despair, love over hatred, hope over fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new sorrows. Such was the nature of existence in this harsh and beautiful land. But tonight, she was home. She was safe. She was loved. And growing beneath her heart was the promise of new life, new possibilities, new reasons to believe that even in the darkest times, dawn would always come again. It was enough. It was everything. It was the beginning of the rest of their lives. Spring returned to the high country with unusual gentleness that year, as if the mountains themselves understood that the McGraw family had endured enough harsh seasons. Sarah's pregnancy progressed peacefully through the warming months, her body growing round and strong while her spirit continued to heal from the wounds of the past. The people of Redemption Creek had embraced their reformed view of Sarah McGraw with the same intensity they had once shown in shunning her. She found herself invited to quilting bees and church socials, consulted on matters of herbal medicine and midwifery, and treated with a respect that bordered on reverence. It was as if the town collectively needed to atone for their previous cruelty by showering her with kindness. "They mean well," Sarah told Anna Morrison one afternoon as they prepared supplies for an expectant mother on the Fletcher ranch. "But sometimes I feel like they've made me into some kind of saint, when all I really did was refuse to die." Anna, a practical woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, smiled knowingly. "Give them time. Dear, people need their stories to make sense. Right now, you're their symbol of redemption, proof that even the darkest situations can have hopeful endings. Eventually, they'll just see you as Sarah again." As her pregnancy advanced, Sarah found herself drawn to the little room that Caleb had begun building as a nursery 2 years ago. The framing was still there, weathered but sound, and together they began the work of finishing it. This time, Sarah chose soft green paint for the walls, the color of new grass in spring. She said, the color of hope growing. Caleb crafted a cradle from pine wood, carving small wildflowers into the headboard with painstaking care. Sarah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands steady despite the memories that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. Each stitch was an act of faith, a declaration that this child would live, would thrive, would know nothing but love and safety. The contractions began on a warm evening in early May, just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks. Sarah had been hanging laundry when the first pain struck, doubling her over with its intensity. Caleb, who had been watching for signs for weeks, was at her side in an instant. "Is it time?" he asked, though the answer was written clearly in her face. Sarah nodded, breathing deeply as the contraction passed. "Send word to Anna and Caleb." She gripped his hand tightly. "Don't leave me. Whatever happens, don't leave me." "Never," he promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Anna Morrison arrived within the hour, bringing with her the calm efficiency of a woman who had delivered countless babies in her 40 years as the territory's most skilled midwife. She examined Sarah with gentle hands, nodding with satisfaction at what she found. "Everything looks normal, dear," she assured them. "First babies often take their time, so we'll likely have a long night ahead of us. Caleb, keep that water hot and stay close. Sarah's going to need your strength before this is over." The labor was indeed long, stretching through the night and into the following day. Sarah walked the floors when she could, leaned against Caleb when the pains grew too intense, and fought with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every trial of the past 2 years. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the contractions grew stronger and closer together. Anna positioned Sarah on the bed they had prepared, speaking words of encouragement while monitoring the baby's progress with experienced hands. "I can see the head," Anna announced, her voice filled with excitement. "One more good push. Sarah, your baby's almost here." Sarah bore down with all her remaining strength, Caleb's hand gripping hers, and suddenly the room was filled with the thin, indignant wail of a newborn. Anna worked quickly, clearing the baby's airway and wrapping the tiny form in soft blankets before placing the child in Sarah's waiting arms. "It's a girl," Anna said, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "A perfect, beautiful baby girl." Sarah stared down at her daughter's wrinkled face, overwhelmed by the miracle of new life. The baby had dark hair like Caleb's and surprisingly bright green eyes that seemed to focus on her mother's face with unusual alertness. When Caleb reached out to touch the tiny fist, the baby's fingers closed around his thumb with surprising strength. "Hello, Hope," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Hello,"
my darling girl.
Caleb knelt beside the bed, studying his daughter's features with wonder.
She's perfect, he said softly.
Absolutely perfect. Word of Hope McGraw's birth spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire, and by evening their cabin was surrounded by well-wishers bearing gifts and congratulations. Doc Morrison arrived to examine both mother and child, pronouncing them both in excellent health. Mayor Blackwood brought a silver rattle that had belonged to his own children, and even Sheriff Coleman stopped by with a hand-carved wooden horse. But perhaps the most meaningful visitor was Billy Whitman, now a gangly teenager who had grown into a thoughtful young man. He approached shyly, carrying a small wooden box that he had obviously made himself.
"Mrs. McGraw," he said, his voice cracking slightly with adolescent awkwardness. "I made this for the baby. It's not much, but I wanted her to have something beautiful." Sarah opened the box to find a tiny music box that played a simple, sweet melody when wound. The craftsmanship was rough but heartfelt, and the gesture brought tears to her eyes. "It's wonderful. Billy, thank you. Hope will treasure it always." As the visitors gradually departed, leaving gifts and promises to return soon, Sarah found herself alone with Caleb and their daughter. The three of them sat together in the gathering twilight, watching Hope sleep peacefully in her father's arms. "2 years ago," Sarah said quietly, "I stood on this hill watching you bury an empty coffin, thinking my life was over. I never imagined—" She gestured toward the baby, toward the life they had built together despite everything. "I never imagined it could end like this." Caleb shifted Hope carefully to one arm and pulled Sarah close with the other. "It's not ending," he said firmly. "It's beginning. Everything we've been through, all the pain and the darkness, it was just the prologue. This is where our real story starts." Outside their window, the mountains stood silhouetted against a star-filled sky. Eternal guardians of the small human joys and sorrows played out in their shadow. The wind whispered through the pine trees with the ancient music of the wilderness, carrying scents of sage and wildflowers and the promise of countless tomorrows. In the weeks that followed, Hope McGraw became the unofficial mascot of Redemption Creek. Everyone wanted to hold her, to marvel at her bright eyes and perfect tiny fingers. The baby seemed to thrive on the attention, gurgling contentedly at visitors and displaying an unusually calm temperament for one so young. Sarah bloomed in motherhood, her face losing the last traces of the haunted look that had shadowed it for so long. She nursed her daughter with quiet contentment, sang lullabies in a voice that grew stronger each day, and began to speak of the future with genuine excitement rather than mere hope. "I want to expand the school," she told Caleb one evening as they sat on their porch with Hope sleeping between them. "Maybe build a proper schoolhouse in town. Bring in a real teacher. These children deserve better than what they're getting now." Caleb smiled, recognizing the spark of ambition that had first attracted him to Sarah Porter all those years ago. "We'll make it happen," he said. "Whatever you want to build, we'll build it together." On Hope's first birthday, the entire town gathered for a celebration that lasted from noon until well after sunset. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in Redemption Creek, and the sound of laughter and music filled the air as children played games and adults shared stories around the fire. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift away, Sarah found herself standing in the same spot where Caleb had once buried her wedding ring, thinking she was dead. Now that hillside was covered with wildflowers and echoed with the sound of her daughter's laughter as the toddler chased fireflies in the gathering darkness. "Mama!" Hope called out, stumbling toward Sarah on unsteady legs, her chubby hands reaching up to be lifted. Sarah swept her daughter into her arms, breathing in the sweet scent of baby hair and milk and innocence. "What is it, sweetheart?" Hope pointed toward the western sky, where the sun was setting in a blaze of gold and crimson. "Pretty," she said, one of her few clear words. "Yes," Sarah agreed, tears of gratitude threatening to overflow. "Very pretty. Just like you, my darling girl." Caleb joined them,
wrapping his arms around both his wife and daughter as they watched the sun disappear behind the mountains. The sky slowly darkened to deep purple, then black, and the stars appeared one by one like scattered diamonds on velvet. "I love you," Sarah whispered, not sure if she was speaking to Caleb or to Hope or to the vast, beautiful world that had given her back everything she thought she had lost. "We love you too," Caleb replied, understanding that the words encompassed not just the three of them, but the entire community that had learned to see past their own fears and prejudices to embrace something larger than themselves. In the distance, a coyote howled, not the lonely sound of a solitary predator, but the complex harmony of a family calling to each other across the darkness. It was the music of the wilderness, ancient and enduring, speaking of survival and hope and the endless cycle of life that continued despite all hardships. Sarah McGraw had come back from the dead not once, but twice. First when she returned from Jeremiah Boone's captivity, and again when she chose to rebuild her life instead of surrendering to despair. Now, holding her daughter under a canopy of stars, she understood that redemption was not a destination but a daily choice. Not a single moment of grace, but a lifetime of small acts of courage and love. The rancher had buried his bride at sunset, believing her lost forever. But she had come back wrapped in hope instead of another man's shirt, carrying new life instead of just the scars of the old, and together they had built something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. A family, a community, a future worth fighting for. As they walked back toward their cabin, Hope sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, Sarah looked up at the stars and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force in the universe had guided her through the darkness and back into the light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to choose hope over despair. But tonight, she was home. She was loved. She was alive. And that was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West, where love conquered even the darkest trials and hope bloomed in the harshest soil. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? Please leave a comment below sharing your location so we can connect with fellow listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, redemption, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Share your thoughts about Sarah and Caleb's journey. Which moment touched you most deeply?